chance to talk a bit about giving a business overview in terms of the business environment for entrepreneurs in Malawi, and also look at some of the research that's been done. So first of all, I'm going to start with a little story about a man named Nalilo Komarano. And in the 1970s, as legend goes, he went to India to try the curry sauce there and thought, in Malawi we have better chilies, and bird's eye chilies, which are hotter, and we can make better sauce. So in the 1970s, he returned to Malawi from his trip and set up and established the Nali group, which produces now 7 different types of Nali sauces. Last week, when I was at the business growth scheme at the Ministry of Industry and Trade, I was told that the wife of the founder of Nali came in almost in tears because they need to purchase equipment in South Africa to upgrade the bottles that they use, because these bottles and the process that is currently used does not allow this to be sold in the EU and the US markets. She can't make the payment because of the forex shortage in Malawi. There's not enough foreign exchange, probably due to the exchange rate policy at present. So I don't really like to start my presentation with looking at the challenges in Malawi, but the last 4 weeks and looking at some of the research that's been coming out at the moment shows that there are some huge constraints on the environment at the moment, especially in terms of electricity provision, forex availability, and also the importing of things, which is a big business for many entrepreneurs, as well as needing fuel that comes in from abroad. It's very scarce. For the last 2 years, there's been periods where people have to queue up. The last few weeks, the petrol and diesel pumps have been dry. So there are quite a few challenges, but at the same time, entrepreneurs are making most of these opportunities. So you see people selling US dollars and kwacha on the parallel market for 100% premium. If I go to the Forex Bureau, I will only be getting 163 kwacha. For the dollar, on the parallel market, it's going for around 300 kwacha. So it's a huge difference. At the same time, petrol is being sold for 3 times as much. And other people are making up to $30 a day sitting in cars for people that can't afford to queue for fuel. So these are some of the things that are going on at the moment. So in this brief overview, I want to explore Malawi's business sector as it is evolving at present, and I will draw on some of the current research on entrepreneurship. As we've discussed, there is also a scarcity of data, and Malawi is no different there. And I think it's probably more difficult than Kenya and South Africa. So Malawi is a low-income country with about GNI per capita of $330 US. Just over half the population are economically active, and 80% of these people are subsistence farmers. So we've got a huge group of people living in rural areas who are making most of their livelihoods from farming and agriculture industry. So already here, I have a little bit of a problem because I can't find out more information about these farmers. What else are they doing besides growing maize, tobacco, and tea? So I think this is already an area, as researchers in Malawi, needs to be a bit more focused on looking at the disaggregated data and how farmers are entrepreneurs as well, because they're just lumped in one group, and there's obviously a huge variety of different ways people are earning income. So according to a recent ILO study that was conducted in 2011, inadequate numbers of jobs are being created for the new entrants to the economy, new entrants into the labour market. Many new entrants are not equipped with the skills to set up businesses and don't have the access to startup capital. This means that, well, as according to this ILO report, that many people are forced into the informal sector and are self-employed, which they say ironically leads to high levels of underemployment but very low levels of unemployment, because according to official statistics in Malawi, only 3 to 5% of people are unemployed. I have questions about that, of course. And there has been some research showing that the distance between students to their primary schools and completing primary school education means that they are able to start up or to act entrepreneurially. So I think there's a lot of potential for research, but also potential to help invest in education, which I think we've heard throughout different presentations today, and also with Professor Harrison yesterday. So access to credit is a huge, huge challenge. Only 18% of the population in Malawi is banked. And just last month, Airtel launched its mobile money scheme. So it's going to be exciting to see the impact that this could have. At the same time, informal, I think I shared this earlier, but informal structures of sharing money are far more predominant than people's reliance on banks. So in the informal sector, another ILO study suggested that 84% of informal sector workers said their biggest constraint is access to finance. But then if you look at the way that they organize themselves, there's a lot of sharing of financial capital. And again, an area where there is huge potential for research. And I think it's very interesting both for the financial institutions in Malawi, but also for the government as they direct policy. So there is a lot of talk in Malawi about creating this entrepreneurial culture. But if you actually talk to people, that's already there. It's not the issue. But just going back to the 1960s with Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda, who was the first president in Malawi, he set up some associations to help boost the private sector. But what he said was that the private sector is well and strong and owned by government. And even since multi-party democracy in 1994, you see that the private sector is actually excluded from most of the discussion, that entrepreneurs aren't involved in helping drive policy changes and helping create policy that will improve their economic environment for them. So there are very few examples of research in entrepreneurs, in an entrepreneurial sector and for the private sector in Malawi, but I found 3 studies that I find particularly interesting that have used qualitative approaches. So the first, and they all look at the business environment and the constraints or the opportunities for entrepreneurs. So the first study is there's currently a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh who grew up in Malawi and whose father is a habitual entrepreneur or portfolio entrepreneur, which means they set up businesses one after another. They have many businesses in their portfolio. And he's done research looking at the constraints on portfolio entrepreneurs and opportunities for them, and then also looking at the way their attitudes towards risk. Then the second study that I've looked at, and I'll explain shortly, was an anthropological study looking at entrepreneurs and the institutional environment in a rural setting in Malawi, and finally we're going to move back to the urban centres to look at a little bit of research that has been done in the informal economy. So for this presentation, I did a lot of literature search and I talked to different people, and I found very little on those, but these are the 3 things I thought were very interesting, so I hope that it's okay to share them with you now. So from the last 2 years, this PhD student, Antonio Ferreiro, has engaged with 122 portfolio entrepreneurs in the city, which is in Malawi, which is a huge number considering that, for example, the World Bank that produces the doing business reports for Malawi only takes in 20 more or 144 businesses. So this is quite a huge study, and it's one of the largest studies on entrepreneurs in Malawi. So he wanted to examine the main environmental constraints for these entrepreneurs. He used semi-structured interviews to do this. He identified that the main constraints for these habitual or portfolio entrepreneurs are firstly regulations, so in the form of taxes, permits that are in place, currency controls, and the lack of incentives for enterprise. Secondly, he found that social and governmental corruption was another constraint for entrepreneurs in this environment, that they found that it was very difficult to operate a business without adapting or using corruption to get by. And then finally, both a constraint but also an opportunity for these entrepreneurs is that they find it difficult to find people with the necessary skills to take managerial roles in their companies, but also it means that the competitive environment in some sense is there are less businesses to compete with, which is not necessarily a good thing at all. And then what I find quite interesting is that in Malawi is a high risk, seen as a high risk context to set up a business, and so he wanted to look at the attitude towards towards risk from the perspective of these entrepreneurs. And normally one thinks if an entrepreneur is successful, in theory, if an entrepreneur is successful, they're more likely to take risk. But he found that in Malawi, the more successful these portfolio entrepreneurs were, the more they showed risk-averse attitudes. So they were trying to mitigate against risk. So he identified several coping strategies, which I find very interesting because he he's looking at these big businesses that have a high turnover in the long run, but I think some of these could be applied to a more, could be looked at in the informal sector as well, which is what I'm interested in. So such risk-averse behaviour included copying successful business models, freezing businesses in the portfolio that were considered to be risky. There was a large degree in property. Bank financing was avoided at all costs. There was an attempt to diversify into new businesses where there was already skill in their existing businesses to do so. And also, the high use of business partners was seen because then they could raise extra capital without going to banks and obviously spread out the risk a bit more. So for me, I find this quite interesting because I think that these things can be identified across the board in Malawi and probably in other countries, and this was the first type of study done in Malawi like this. So the second area of research was conducted in 2009 by a group of anthropologists from a Dutch university in a rural setting in Malawi in a village called Matengo. And they wanted to look at the entrepreneurial process rather than just focus on individual entrepreneurs. So they conducted ethnographic research in terms of living with the communities for a few months, and they identified that the institution at play in this community, and I think they could see this in other communities across Malawi, was that the social obligations that entrepreneurs had governed the way they acted. So they found that, for example, if a businessman owned a car in an area where people are starving, it was seen as proof that they were not fulfilling their social obligations. And so if they didn't fulfill their social obligations in this village, they were at risk of being sanctioned, and this was in the form of witchcraft in Vitengo. And so they highlight in their paper two different case studies. One of a man who sells, is a mechanic, and he withdraws, he develops a social distance from the other villagers, he builds a wall around his property, and he engages with a local Sinanga or witch doctor and buys the necessary mikwalo to protect his house, so that he is kind of protecting himself because he knows he is not meeting the social obligations, which is the institution in which this setting is. But then they look at a man who's selling tobacco, and they say that he engages in the society by supporting the local school and helping fund wealthy relatives, or helping fund with his wealthy relatives, and that by so doing he meets the social obligations. And they, from the study, that they were trying to show that the process entrepreneurs take in this rural setting is very much influenced by the institutional forces and the sanctions. And so that was one study, very different from the first one, so I thought it was interesting to mention. I think it might cause a bit of debate. And then finally, for my own interest, I tried to look up what is going on in terms of research and what people know about the informal sector, because this has been quite a contentious site in Malawi. In the last 10 years, the two previous presidents, the one we have now, have introduced policies to bring the vendors in urban centres into special designated areas, and this has caused a lot of problems, especially because the president, the now late president, claimed to have said that the vendors can now go anywhere, so they went anywhere, and 2 months ago the police came and cracked down and pushed them back, and there was looting and a lot of problems. And so I found one paper which was not peer reviewed, and it was just in an academic publication. And so Kayuni and Tambalasi in 2009 examined the political framework for vendors in Zomba, which is probably the third largest town in Malawi. It's in the south of Malawi. And he found that, they found that through their interviews, that the impact of designating the informal sector or the vendors to a particular area had a detrimental impact on their revenue they generated and the competition. So I think this, for me in particular, is a very interesting area of potential future research because it has such a huge impact on the urban environments in Malawi. So these three studies I have selected indicate that political institutions and entrepreneurs are so intimately linked, which is what I'm sure we all know. And I think this has been most apparent in the entrepreneurial activities that have arisen in the last 2 years in Malawi with the particular economic constraints, and particularly the shortages of fuel and forex the shortage of electrical supply, which is detrimentally affecting medium-sized businesses, so in particular in the industrial sector. So personally, as I embark on my research for my master's, I'm looking into the possibilities of exploring how these entrepreneurial activities have arisen, and now what I mentioned earlier, what is going to happen now that certain things are being changed, and what forex is not going to be in as in short supply as it has been, and fuel is going to come back, and so what's going to happen to these entrepreneurs who make most of these opportunities. So that I find very interesting. But it's also an area of contention, or a very heated area to go and look at the informal sector, because many of the constraints that have been placed on this sector, and Malawians in general over the last couple of years, being blamed on government mismanagement policy. So to go in and try to talk about this with people has potential difficulties. But it doesn't end there, because as most of you know, last week we unfortunately lost our third president, and we now have the second female president in Africa as our president, Joyce Banda. And I just want to talk a little bit for a couple of minutes about her and tell you a little bit about her history, because she is where she is today because she was able to set up a business because her husband could act as a signatory on her bank account. And from that, she realized that many women in Malawi in the 1990s did not have that opportunity because of a male relative or husband or father to help them set up an account. So she established BIEA, which is the National Association for Businesswomen in Malawi, which was particularly aimed at empowering, giving training skills and access to credit to women in the informal sector or very small micro businesses. And so currently there are 300,000 women part of this association. There hasn't been no research done, so what I'm saying is from anecdote, but there are several MPs, female MPs now in our government that are where they are today because they say, because of this association and being able to group together with other women to acquire capital, that they have set up bank accounts to come together and bring pool skills. And at the same time, the BIEA has also had a good impact on reducing harassment for women who are cross-border traders, because there's often a lot of harassment at the borders when they bring in items. So I think that's quite exciting. So while I may have started, and a lot of my presentation has actually looked at some of the challenges and the constraints, Malawians are very hopeful at the moment for what Joyce Banda represents as an entrepreneurial force, and we are very hopeful that she will bring back into place and things that will help rebalance the terms of trade and change the current exchange rate policy, which is causing a negative impact on the environment and the business environment. So I leave you on that note, and I just say watch this space. Thank you.